I don't want your hope. I don't want you to be hopeful. I want you to panic. I want you to feel the fear I feel every day.
Well, which politician has ever reached you like that about climate change? You can hear it in her voice, can't you? 16-year-old Greta Thornburg, desperately sad about what's happening to our planet. For nearly a year now, she's been staging a so-called school strike, at first alone, and then joined by hundreds of thousands of others around the globe. And it's not just school kids. World leaders are supporting her, even the Pope. But are they just paying lip service, or are they really ready to act? We're going to get into all of that with our guests in a moment, but first, a quick look at Greta, truly a force of nature.
Our civilization is so fragile. It is almost like a castle built in the sand. The facade is so beautiful, but the foundations are far from solid. My name is Greta Thornburg. I am 16 years old. I come from Sweden, and I want you to panic. I want you to act as if the house was on fire. Deforestation of our great forests, toxic air pollution, loss of insects and wildlife, the acidification of our oceans. These are all disastrous trends being accelerated by a way of life that we see as our right to simply carry on. That is why millions of children are taking it to the streets. You need to listen to us.
How do you feel about the fact that this whole movement has essentially been started by your actions last year?
It feels incredible that one person can do this and then tens of thousands of children from all around the world are doing the same thing.
You really inspired people just all around the world.
Greta Thornburg is a young woman from Sweden who has decided to make it her life's mission to save the world from climate change.
When I grow up, I'll be able to look back and say that I did what I could back then.
You talk a lot about the young people, but not with the young people. And with Greta, it was quite amazing how all these business leaders and the politicians, maybe for the first time, actually had to face someone so young.
Adults keep saying, we owe it to the young people to give them hope. But I don't want your hope. I want you to act.
Well, an incredibly tenacious and inspiring youngster. And here is how she's been putting the pressure on the so-called grown-ups over the past 9 months. Well, she stopped going to school altogether on August the 20th, just as Sweden was about to hold an election. Every day during school hours, she would sit outside Parliament, often alone, demanding action on climate change. She didn't go back until after the vote 3 weeks later. She then dialed it down a bit, striking only on Fridays. She called it Fridays for Future, and by November, kids were striking in solidarity around 270 cities around the world. Fridays for Future had become a movement and staged its global climate strike on March the 15th. They claim 1.5 million people took part on all 7 continents, yes, even Antarctica. Well, let's bring in our panel now. And up there on the top left, we have Rob Lyons. He is a journalist who writes about technology and the climate and other things. He also says kids ought to really get back to school. Sophie Cowan, she used to be a hotshot executive in the advertising industry. She now puts the dark arts to good use for Extinction Rebellion. And in the bottom left there, we have Jean Hinchliffe. And she's a 15-year-old activist who finds Greta very inspiring. And she's joining us from Sydney, so she's staying up late for us. Jean, I would like to start with you. Tell me how Greta inspired you to act.
I got involved as soon as I heard about Greta. I thought that her actions were incredible. And as a young person whose voice doesn't really get heard, striking felt like this incredible way that I can actually have a say. And due to that, I think that she really is just so powerful.
And how many children are involved in the Fridays for Future or Fridays for Climate Action?
Yeah, in Australia alone, what we do is instead of having weekly strikes, we stage big strikes every few months. So our first strike was November 30th, where 15,000 people went on strike across the country. Our second was March 15th, where our numbers increased tenfold to 150,000. And that joins global forces of 1.5 million on March 15th. And it's really this incredible movement that seems to be growing exponentially right now.
Now, Greta's family allow her to do this, but her father would prefer that she didn't have to sacrifice school, of course. What's your family's approach to you and what you're trying to do?
I will say they don't want me taking too much time off of school because I actually work as an actress, so already I'm on set most days. But I think seeing their reaction to having these really big strikes and my key role as an organizer here, they have been as supportive as they can, along with my school as well. Although, as the rules state here in Australia, schools may not endorse it. They can just sort of allow kids to go if they have a note from their parents. So it's more difficult over here in comparison to a lot of other places.
Now, Jean, you have your own particular set of challenges in Australia. Bit of an uphill struggle, you might say. They've got a Conservative government there and a somewhat traditional Prime Minister. Here he is talking about the school strike movement back in November.
Kids should go to school. That's what we're committed to. We don't support the idea of kids not going to school to participate in things that can be dealt with outside of school. And so what we want is more learning in schools and less activism in schools.
More learning, less activism. What do you make of the Prime Minister's comment, Jean, and how are you going to change your behaviour?
Well, honestly, this form of activism is really an incredible way of learning. I know that my experience working with School Strike for Climate has taught me much more than any class I've missed during a day off. I think the fact that blanket statement that we need less activism in our schools and more learning is ridiculous, in fact, because one thing is that schools aren't allowed to endorse it. They're not allowed to let this culture of activism thrive. And because of that, even in the first place, that's just incorrect. And from there, the kids who are educated are the ones out on the streets. They know about the climate crisis.
Oh, that's a good point.
They have opinions about it, and because of that, they take part.
To be fair to the Prime Minister, he wasn't saying you can't have any activism, just you shouldn't let it impinge on your school. But then again, being on strike, perhaps that's part of the pressure.
Definitely. I think that the fact of the matter is that we've spent years writing speeches and letters and having events on weekends. And the fact of the matter is that no one's listened to us. So we've gotten to a stage where we feel like we need to strike to have our voices heard. And because of that, that's why we're taking this drastic action. If they just listened to us and took climate action, then we wouldn't be striking.
Jean, you have an election coming up, and how are you going to be applying pressure in the next few days?
Well, what we're having actually on May 18th, which is our election, is school strikers going to polling booths, and they'll be standing outside and handing out flyers which state different parties' climate policies. So what we're trying to do is really make sure voters know that they need to be voting for our futures and voting climate.
Jean, thank you for that. You know, Greta's not been to Australia yet, not as a campaigner anyway, but she has been to the United Kingdom very recently to address the British Parliament and to address the climate change movement Extinction Rebellion. Now, these are some pictures from Marble Arch, one of the four big sites the campaign has occupied around London. The movement's civil disobedience is aimed at putting pressure on the government to act for climate change.
It's an honour for me to be here with you today. Together we are making a difference.
Well, let's bring in our second guest, Sophie Cowan now. She works for Extinction Rebellion. Sophie, just explain the relationship between Greta Thunberg and your movement, Extinction Rebellion.
Thank you, Matthew. So Greta Thunberg is yet another conduit of the emergency messaging that is necessary in order for our politicians to act on the climate and ecological emergency. So Greta is a beautiful representation of this energy that is starting to emerge all around the world of anger and action in the face of the climate crisis.
And why did you invite her to address your movement?
She came to address the movement. We invited her because she is, as I say, another voice in this struggle.
How did the crowd respond to her? Is she a bit of a hero?
Yeah, I mean, it's beautiful how she speaks with such truth. She speaks in a very black and white way. It's very straightforward. We're facing a crisis. We need to act, and it's very clear, you know, from Jean over in Australia and from the thousands of school strikers around the world and the people joining Extinction Rebellion and environmental activists that have been struggling and fighting for this cause for years and years.
Sophie, could you just
remind us? She's another voice.
And could you just remind us what Greta's demands are and how they overlap with Extinction Rebellion's demands?
So Greta is demanding that the Swedish government reduce carbon emissions in alignment with the Paris Agreement to maintain global warming to below 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. Our demands are for the government to declare a climate and ecological emergency and to act on this. So we are all looking at the science and demanding of our governments that they follow up the science and the IPCC report and act. It's all the same struggle. We've got thousands of activists around the world that are fighting for the same thing.
OK, well, thank you, Sophie. You know what, while she was in Britain, she also addressed the British MPs at the Houses of Parliament, and frankly, she gave them a good telling off, and they still applauded.
You lied to us. You gave us false hope. You told us that the future was something to look forward to. And the saddest thing is that most children are not even aware of the fate that awaits us. We will not understand it until it's too late. The UK, however, is very special. Not only for its mind-blowing historical carbon debt, but also for its current, very creative carbon account. Since 1990...
What's interesting is that about a week after that address, the British Parliament became the first in the world to declare a climate change emergency.
This House must declare an environment and climate emergency. We have no time to waste. We are living in a climate crisis that will spiral dangerously out of control unless we take rapid and dramatic action now.
As many as I've been say aye. Aye. On the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it.
Sophie, how much of that rather symbolic declaration was down to your movement, Extinction Rebellion? How much of it was down to Greta? Because they were falling all over themselves to applaud her and to be seen with her.
I think, as I said before, there is this emerging energy that we need to do something about the climate crisis. Greta, Extinction Rebellion, the youth strikes are all part of this movement. We are here because of the decades of criminal inaction of the governments. And so how much was down to Greta, how much was down to XR, how much was down to the youth strike? I don't think it's a hugely relevant question. I think the relevant question is what we do now, whether we need to keep holding our politicians to their promises and hold them to act on the crisis. That's what the question is. OK, let's bring in our final guest, Rob Lyons. Now, as I mentioned, a journalist who's a little bit sceptical about the whole Greta Thunberg phenomena. Rob, when you were, as a journalist, watching various politicians sidling up next to Greta, what was your reaction? What was your gut feeling about that?
Well, I was a bit disappointed, really, that there was such a fawning attitude towards her. That I think they see that this is a PR opportunity to be seen to be on the right side of things, and I think that there's quite a bit of bad faith going on in politicians that that they're doing that. But also, I think that they do see that Greta is a symbol by which certain politicians, not all politicians, want to get a certain agenda about climate across, and they see somebody that you can't argue with, because that's the way Greta has been treated. You can't argue with her as perfect. It's basically saying the children have said this, they're right, and we just have to act now, and there's no point in having further discussion about how the hell we do all of this reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. We just need to get on with it, and I think that that's actually quite scary.
The thing is, Rob, thousands, tens of thousands of scientists have signed various documents that support what she and Extinction Rebellion have said. She seems to be merely restating orthodox scientific fact. You don't agree with that?
I think that the world is warming. I think that human beings are playing a part in that warming process. How much it's going to warm, what's the best thing to do about that, and what kind of problems we will face from that, and how to tackle those. These are all big questions, and I'm afraid actually scientists aren't really able to answer those questions. They can only tell us whether the world's going to get warmer or not. That's it.
Yeah, Rob, you're not the only one to be somewhat sceptical about how she came to prominence amongst the climate change activists. There was an article in The Spectator, for example, which was questioning whether she was the product of a carefully set up PR campaign. It says a Swiss magazine, quote, revealed that Thunberg's school strike had coincided neatly with the launch of a book about climate change written by her mother. Is this a coincidence, it poses? It looks less likely when you learn that the first publicity of Thunberg's protest came via the social media of the book's PR man, Ingmar Rentzhog, on the day of the launch. Back to you for a moment, Rob. What more have you heard about that, and does it chime with what you suspect?
In some ways, I'm not that interested in whether she's got a PR campaign behind her. What's interesting to me is, on the one hand, I think that the reaction of school students around the world is genuine, but also I think that it's the way in which certain politicians and figures like the Pope have promoted Greta. That's much more significant to me.
Papa Francisco, esta es Greta, la chica famosa. Vino especialmente para conocerte y hablar en el Senado italiano, que como sabrás es una estrella mundial, millones y millones de seguidores, invitando y movilizando contra el cambio climático. Sí, felicito. And would you like to say anything to Pope Francis?
Yes, thank you for standing up for climate, for speaking the truth. And really, it means a lot.
God bless you. Continue to walk, eh? Continue. Eh?
Does that annoy you, Jean, that Rob is saying it's a 16-year-old girl and therefore her concerns shouldn't be taken as seriously as an adult?
I will say it does annoy me. In 2 years' time, Greta will have the right to vote. We, as young people, we're still citizens. Our voices should be heard. And the fact of the matter is that right now we're living in the internet age, and it is so much easier than it ever has been before to be educated upon a topic and to really understand it. And seeing this information, when you see 97% of climate scientists agree that climate change is an important issue and that it's caused by humans.
No, Jean,
and because of this, we're able to see this problem. And I think that as young people, we're able to understand that, and we deserve to have our voices heard. Just because Greta is 16 doesn't mean that she's an idiot or she doesn't understand it or that she doesn't deserve to be able to have her voice heard, because she took that initiative to strike.
Sophie, I want to come to you for a moment, but you left one of the most elite advertising agencies in the world to join Extinction Rebellion, and so you know that if you and a bunch of other execs were to sit around and come up with the perfect person who couldn't be challenged, you couldn't come up with anyone better than Greta Thunberg, could you?
She's an incredibly strong spokesperson. She is, as I say, a member of this grassroots movement who is basically coming up in the complete vacuum of any top-down leadership. And so, yes, she is a fantastic person, as are thousands of people around the world who are fighting for the same thing, to fight for this. I think what's interesting here is that we're still discussing sort of marketing and advertising, this campaign idea. And I actually just think that that is really dangerous for some, like a very, a respected media organisation like TRT World that wants to inspire change, and we're still debating whether this is a PR campaign or whether the politicians are sidling up to her. That's not the point. The point is we are in a crisis and we need to act now.
Well, these are points of views that come from others, and we have to be open to that. In fact, one of the objections that Greta's critics tend to make is that she's scaremongering, and of course she'd say it is actually time to panic. So there's no scaremongering there. It has to happen. But whatever your view, it's clear that youngsters are moved by what she has to say, as we found out when we went to meet them around the British Parliament.
I'm here today Because I want to help the world.
I am here because I don't want to die in 12 years.
I know that climate change is a thing and it's very scary and it's something that I feel very passionate about.
I think it's important for young people like me to be involved in it because adults aren't doing anything.
I think it's ridiculous for people to say we're too young because they didn't do anything, they've left it down to us.
I want to tell Theresa May over there that I don't like climate change.
We got to do something about it because it's our future, and if we want the world to be a better place, then we got to fight for it.
Greta Thornburg, she really inspired me.
What she is doing, spreading awareness about climate change, is very inspiring.
If we act now, address the situation, and then do something about it, then it will help a lot.
Well, back to Rob for a moment. Rob, I suspect you're the only one who's going to support the view that children should just be allowed to be children and not burdened with the climate change crisis.
Well, I think that, if we're going to ask children for their opinion, then I think that we're in really big trouble. I think that what we have to do is ask more challenging questions like, is what you propose we should do about climate change actually going to make everybody worse off? Is it actually going to be a bigger problem than the climate change so-called emergency that you're railing against? And I think that is the case. So, I think that what we should do is give children a much more balanced sense of what's going on in the world, that actually we're living healthier and wealthier lives, fewer and fewer people are living in poverty, and actually that what we're seeing is a relatively gradual increase in global temperatures and that we can adapt to and cope with and actually continue that process by which the average of living standards and life expectancy continues to grow.
Sophie, how do you get the balance right? Because you want to make people aware, but you don't want them to make them feel hopeless or depressed.
I totally understand that. I think there is a balance, but also, living standards may have gone up for a certain percentage of the world, but, this is an international movement. We have people dying from floods, from droughts, from adverse weather conditions as a result of climate change currently in the global south now. We have this movement which is allowing those voices to be heard, to be platformed, and we need to listen to the people who are already suffering from this problem.
Jean, just be the voice of your generation for a moment, if you could. It's an impossible ask, but anyway, I know, children can feel overburdened by this and feel hopeless. Is Greta helping to motivate them, or is she actually making things worse for them?
Well, I think she's really motivating us, and personally myself, I have felt a lot of anxiety and panic around the climate crisis, and being able to strike and being able to have a figurehead like Greta, I think has really made us feel inspired and motivated, and almost as if things can get better and that the climate crisis has a chance of being averted with this new movement. And I think as young people, we're able to have opinions and be effective in the way that we express them, and being able to have an outlet for that has been really incredible.
Jean, thank you for that. The state of the planet so affected Greta that at just 11 years of age, she actually became depressed, and she was diagnosed with Asperger's around 4 years ago. And she says she finds it hard to stop thinking about the things that she really cares about, but it also gives her an incredible focus, which has its benefits.
For those of us who are on the spectrum, almost everything is black or white. We aren't very good at lying, and we usually don't enjoy participating in the social game that the rest of you seem so fond of. I think in many ways that we autistic are the normal ones, and the rest of the people are pretty strange. Especially when it comes to the sustainability crisis. I don't understand that, because if the emissions have to stop, then we must stop the emissions. To me, that is black or white. There are no grey areas when it comes to survival.
Back to Sophie for just a moment. Sophie, I came to this subject relatively recently, and I was quite moved in a way that I hadn't been by the adults. And it's not just that, it's her directness. That is a very refreshing way of delivering the same message.
It totally is. I think the power that Greta has is she's very calmly stating that we are in a crisis, and that she is now acting. And I think, as Jean was saying, there's this element of you move through the grief of recognising the situation and into action, and it is giving a lot of people, clearly thousands of activists around the world now this element of courage that they can change things, that the politicians have been failing them, and that they are taking it into their own hands. And that's what this movement is inspiring, that's what Greta is inspiring, and it's absolutely beautiful that this energy is now being harnessed and brought together.
Thank you for that, Sophie. You get the last word. We have run out of time, I'm afraid. And thank you to our other guests, Rob Lyons there and Jean Hinchliffe. Thank you so much for staying up late in Sydney. Really appreciate it. Appreciate your time. And thank you for watching. Remember, you can see this and all our previous episodes on our YouTube channel. But until next week, goodbye.